On the freezing kitchen counter, my mom's note read, "We withdrew the fund for a cruise. Clean up Victor yourself, he stinks." I found my stepdad shivering in a puddle of urine. I tasted his painkiller and my heart flatlined. It was tap water. She traded his life for a vacation. As I tried to call 911, he slipped his ring into my hand and whispered, 3.2M, Jenna, it's time. I had been driving for 12 hours straight when I finally pulled into the driveway, and even before I opened the car door, I knew something was wrong. No porch light, no kitchen light. The house sat dark against a sky that had been threatening snow since Ohio, and my first thought was that the power must be out. It wasn't. I let myself in with the spare key under the fake rock my mother had bought at a garden center a decade ago. The door stuck the way it always did in cold weather, and I put my shoulder into it. Inside, the air hit me first. Not cold like outside cold. Cold like the heat had been off long enough for the house to give up trying. The note was on the kitchen counter, held down under a coffee mug with something dried and dark in the bottom. I read it twice because the first time my brain simply refused the information. "We withdrew the fund for a cruise. Clean up Victor yourself, he stinks." No signature, though I knew the handwriting well enough not to need one. No explanation of where they'd gone or when they'd be back. Just an instruction, tossed off the way you'd leave a note for a house sitter about the mail. I didn't feel fear first. I felt something closer to a held breath, the sensation of standing at the top of a staircase in the dark, not yet knowing how many steps there are. Fear came when I looked at the thermostat and saw it reading 52 degrees. The little display glowing blue in a house gone silent except for the furnace clicking uselessly, trying and failing to catch. I've been a combat medic for 6 years. None of that training made the walk down that hallway any easier. If anything, it made it worse because I knew exactly what 52 degrees could do to a body that wasn't young anymore, wasn't strong anymore, had already been fighting a war on the inside for the better part of 2 years. I called his name once, quietly. Nothing answered back. The bathroom door was half open at the end of the hall, and I saw him before I fully processed it. Victor, on the floor, on his side, one arm folded under him at an angle that made my stomach drop before I even got close. The blanket that should have covered him was kicked halfway across the tile, and the smell in that small room told me plainly what had happened here and how long. I dropped to my knees next to him. "Victor." I put 2 fingers against his throat before I even finished saying his name, counting automatically. Pulse there. Weak, ready, too fast, but there. His skin had the wrong color. A gray-blue undertone the yellow bathroom light couldn't hide, and his forearm was cold in a way skin isn't supposed to get while a person is still breathing. His eyes opened partway. Just enough for me to see he recognized me, and the first thing he did was try to apologize. "Sorry," he managed, teeth chattering hard enough the word came apart. "Didn't want you to see." "Don't," I said. "Don't you dare apologize to me right now." I got my arms under him and hauled him up against the bathtub, checking his breathing rate, counting against the 10 count I'd learned to run without thinking. Too shallow, too fast, consistent with hypothermia, with a body left too long without anyone checking on it. "How long?" I said, not really a question. "How long have you been on this floor?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted, unfocused, and for one terrible second I thought I was losing him before I'd even called for help. Then his hand moved, closing weakly around my wrist. "Since yesterday," he whispered, "maybe the day before. I lost count somewhere." I didn't let him see my face change. What I actually felt was a white-hot fury with nowhere yet to go. Only the raw fact of a man left alone on cold tile for the better part of 2 days by the people supposed to be checking on him. I reached for my phone. My hands were not as steady as I wanted them to be. The dispatcher's voice was calm in the practiced way that always makes emergencies feel briefly more survivable, and I gave her the address, the vitals, the timeline, all in the flat clinical shorthand that came out automatically while my free hand worked to get Victor's soaked clothes off him. Possible hypothermia, possible dehydration, patient is 71, cardiac history, on the floor, an estimated 36 to 48 hours. I said, "Ma'am, is the patient conscious and breathing?" "Yes, conscious, breathing, pulse present, but weak and rapid. I'm a combat medic. I can start warming protocols while you dispatch. Just tell me you're sending someone." "Ambulance is en route, ma'am. Approximately 11 minutes given the roads." 11 minutes. I did the math without meaning to and decided it was survivable if I did everything right between now and then. I got him out of the wet clothes and into dry ones from the hamper, moving fast. I dragged the space heater in from the hall closet and aimed it directly at him, and piled every blanket I could find on top of him without covering his face, watching his breathing the whole time to make sure the warming wasn't shocking his system. He kept saying my name, quietly, over and over, like a man checking that a door was still locked. "Jenna, Jenna, you're here." "I'm here," I told him, checking his pulse again, checking his pupils with the flashlight on my phone. "I'm not going anywhere. You hear me?" Somewhere in the middle of all that, the part of my brain not fully occupied with keeping him alive started assembling a timeline. My mother's note had said they'd withdrawn the fund for a cruise, present tense, recent. This wasn't weeks ago. This was days, maybe less, which meant somebody had made a decision, deliberately, to leave a 71-year-old man with a cardiac history alone in a house with the heat off and then had gotten on a plane. I didn't let myself finish that thought yet. There would be time for it later. His breathing steadied under the heater and the blankets. Color came back into his lips. I checked his pulse again. Still fast, but less thready, and I let myself exhale for what felt like the first time since I'd walked through that front door. "Your meds," I said, already moving toward the bathroom cabinet. "When did you last take anything for the pain?" He didn't answer right away, and something in that silence made me turn around. "Victor, when did you last take your medication?" "I don't." His eyes were half closed again. "I took it this morning, I think. It didn't do anything. Hasn't been doing anything for days." I found the amber prescription bottle exactly where I expected it, label facing out. I unscrewed the cap and pulled the small glass dropper free, holding it up toward the light out of pure habit. The same automatic check I'd run 1,000 times on 1,000 different medications in the field. Something was wrong before I'd even consciously registered what. Real liquid pain medication has a certain weight to it when you tilt the dropper. A slight viscosity, often a faint cloudy tint, and almost always some trace of a chemical scent sharp enough to notice. My hands know the difference before my conscious mind catches up. This liquid was thin, watery, moving inside the glass with none of the resistance it should have had. I brought it closer and it was clear. Not cloudy, not amber, just clear, the way water is clear. I told myself I was wrong, that exhaustion and cold were making me see problems that weren't there, and nearly recapped the bottle and moved on. But 6 years of training doesn't let you talk yourself out of a direct physical check when one is available. I tipped the dropper and let a single drop fall onto my tongue, waiting for the sharp, bitter sting real medication in this class carries. Nothing came, no bitterness, no numbing, no trace, none at all, of anything beyond the flat mineral taste of ordinary tap water. I stood there holding a bottle labeled with a real pharmacy's name, a real doctor's name, real dosage instructions, and understood with total, sickening clarity that someone had refilled it with water from the kitchen sink. I looked back at Victor. He'd been watching me the whole time, watching my face while I ran the check, watching the exact moment my expression changed. "You knew," I said quietly. It wasn't really a question. He closed his eyes. "I didn't want to believe it either," he said. "The paramedics arrived at 9 minutes, not 11, and I have never in my life been so relieved to hear a siren." I gave them the handoff in clipped shorthand, vitals and timeline and the concern about the medication, and watched two competent strangers do exactly what I would have done if I'd had the equipment. I rode with him, holding the small glass bottle the entire way, wrapped in a plastic bag one of the paramedics gave me without my having to ask, because some instinct already understood this bottle was evidence now. The ride took 18 minutes. He drifted in and out on the gurney, and twice, in the moments he surfaced, he tried to talk. Not about the cold, not about the days on the floor. Both times he said something that didn't fully make sense to me yet, something I filed away without understanding its weight. The first time, his hand found my sleeve and he murmured, "Not everything. Tell them not everything." I leaned closer. "Not everything what, Victor?" But his eyes had already closed again, his breathing evening out under the warming blanket, and I told myself it was the confusion of hypothermia talking. A half sentence a cold, exhausted brain produces without meaning anything specific by it. I was wrong about that. I understand now how wrong I was. But in that ambulance, with sirens overhead and a man I loved fading in and out of consciousness in front of me, I didn't have room to hold on to a cryptic half sentence as anything more than noise. The emergency room moved fast once we arrived. IV fluids, warming protocols, blood work to check the damage to his kidneys, his electrolytes, his heart. I stood in the hallway outside the curtain, and for the first time since walking through that front door, I had nothing left to do with my hands. That's when the anger caught up with me. Not the controlled, useful kind that had gotten him warm and gotten him here. The other kind that has nowhere productive to go and just sits in your chest like a stone. I thought about my mother on a cruise ship somewhere, entirely unaware, or worse, entirely aware and simply unbothered that the man she married was on a gurney fighting his way back because she'd decided a vacation mattered more than checking whether he was still breathing. A doctor came out eventually, a tired-looking woman with the particular gentleness emergency medicine either burns out of people or teaches them to protect fiercely. She told me he was stable, dehydrated, hypothermic, his kidney function showing some strain, but nothing they expected to be permanent given prompt treatment. "Another day," she said factually, "maybe less than that given his cardiac history. You got him here just in time." I didn't tell her about the bottle yet. I would eventually, once I understood who needed to hear it and in what order. They moved him to a room a few hours later, and I sat beside his bed and watched the color slowly return to his face, watched the monitor's steady rhythm confirm what the doctor had already told me. He woke fully somewhere around midnight. His eyes found me immediately, clearer now than in the bathroom, clearer than in the ambulance, and the first thing he did was reach for my hand. "You found me," he said. His voice was still rough but steadier. "I found you. I didn't think anyone would check for at least another week." Something cold settled in my stomach. "You knew you were going to be alone that long?" He was quiet for a moment, studying my face with something calculating underneath the exhaustion that I hadn't seen from him before. "Not in all the years I'd known him. I knew a lot of things," he said finally. "I've known them for a while." I didn't push further that night. He was exhausted, I was exhausted, and some instinct told me whatever he meant by that sentence deserved more than a hospital room at midnight. I stayed until the nurses gently insisted I go find somewhere to actually sleep, and even then I only went as far as the family waiting room, where I sat with that small glass bottle held tight in my lap and did not sleep. Not really, not for a long time. He was moved out of the ICU and into a standard recovery room 2 days later, and by the third day the color in his face looked almost normal, his appetite returning enough that he complained about the hospital food, which felt like the most reassuring sound I'd heard in nearly a week. I let myself relax, just slightly, for the first time since walking through that front door. I let myself believe, sitting there in that ordinary hospital chair, that the worst of it was already behind us. My mother still hadn't called. Not the hospital, not me directly, nothing. I checked my phone obsessively, half hoping and half dreading to see her name appear. It appeared on the 4th day, while I sat beside his bed watching him work through a bowl of hospital soup. I stepped into the hallway to take it. "Jenna, finally," she said, before I'd even gotten a full hello out. There was music behind her, tinny and distant. I've been trying to reach your brother for 2 days and he's not answering. Do you know if he's still coming to Melissa's thing? Mom, I kept my voice level. Victor's in the hospital. A pause. Not shock. Mild irritation at an inconvenient interruption. Is he all right? He was on the bathroom floor for almost 2 days. Hypothermic. His kidneys were under enough strain that the doctor used the word permanent before she qualified it. He almost died in the house. Well, he's stubborn, Jenna. He probably just fell and didn't want to bother anyone. His pain medication was tap water. The pause that followed was longer. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally, her voice gone careful. The prescription bottle. Someone refilled it with tap water. I tasted it myself before I gave it to the paramedics as evidence. Evidence? She laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. Jenna, you're being dramatic. Maybe the pharmacy made a mistake. The pharmacy doesn't refill bottles with sink water, Mom. Another pause. Then, quieter, almost too quiet over the music. It was expensive. That medication? We had the cruise deposit due and I thought just until we got back he wouldn't even notice the difference. He sleeps through most of the pain anyway. I have relived that sentence more times than I can count. Not delivered as a confession, more as an explanation she genuinely believed would land as reasonable if she laid out the math clearly enough. You knew, I said, flatter than the fury underneath should have allowed. You knew what would happen if he didn't have it, and you decided a deposit mattered more. Don't be so dramatic. He's fine. He's fine because I found him in time. A day later, he wouldn't be. He'd be dead and you'd find out from a voicemail while you were on a beach somewhere. The music got louder, and when she spoke again, her voice had hardened into something more familiar, the tone she used whenever she felt cornered. You've always taken his side over mine. I am your mother, Jenna. Whatever you think happened, I did not try to hurt him. I'm not saying you tried to hurt him, I said quietly. I'm saying you decided his pain and his safety were negotiable, and that's so much worse. She hung up on me. I opened my voice memo app and saved the recording I'd been running the entire call, an old habit from years of documenting things in the field where memory alone was never enough. I walked back into his room. He was watching me when I came through the door, tracking my face with the same careful, evaluating look he'd had that first night. That was her, he said, not a question. That was her. And I sat down and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 4 days straight. And I think I finally believe you almost dying wasn't an accident she's willing to take responsibility for. Victor was quiet, something in his expression settling into a tired resolve I hadn't seen before, not even in the ambulance, not even holding that bottle. Good, he said. That makes what comes next a lot simpler. I didn't fully understand what he meant by that yet. I had no idea, sitting in that chair, how much further this still had to go. He was discharged 6 days after I found him, weaker than before but stable, cleared by both specialists, with a stack of follow-up appointments and a stern warning about hydration. He waved off almost immediately once we were in the car. I brought him home, though the word felt strange in my mouth by then. I turned the heat up before we even walked through the door, checked it twice, checked it a third time an hour later, out of something that wasn't quite paranoia, but sat close enough to it that I recognized the feeling. He slept most of that first day back, exhausted in the particular way recovery exhausts a person, deeper than tiredness. I sat in the living room with my laptop, half working, half staying within earshot, and jumped every time he shifted in the next room. A woman named Patricia called the following morning, before I'd even had coffee, asking to speak with him directly. Something in her voice, a brisk professionalism that didn't invite negotiation, made me hand him the phone instead. He talked to her for almost 20 minutes, mostly short affirmations, occasional pauses where he was clearly listening to something detailed. When he hung up, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Patricia's coming by this afternoon, he said. She's my attorney. Your attorney. I turned the phrase over. In all the years I'd known him, I'd never once heard him mention an attorney of his own. My mother had one, for the house, for the will they'd drafted together years ago. Victor had never mentioned having one separately. There's some things I need to get sorted, he said, and something in his tone closed the subject. Paperwork, given everything that's happened. I told myself that made sense. Insurance claims, maybe formal documentation in case my mother tried to minimize it later. Maybe the beginning of the legal separation I assumed was coming. I did not, in that moment, imagine anything beyond the ordinary shape of divorce paperwork. Patricia arrived a little after 2, carrying a leather folder thick enough to look more like a small briefcase, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done difficult family situations many times before. She was polite to me, professionally warm, but asked gently and directly if she could have some time alone with Victor. Of course, I said, and meant it. This was his business. I had no claim on being present for it. I settled into a chair outside the closed door with a cup of tea I didn't really want. I thought about the recording still saved in my phone, my mother's voice explaining herself over the sound of a party I hadn't been invited to. I thought, for the first time in nearly a week, that maybe the worst genuinely had passed, that whatever came next would unfold now at an ordinary human pace instead of the emergency pace we'd been living inside since I first read that note on the kitchen counter. I let myself believe that, sitting in that hallway. I want to be clear about how completely I believed it. Their conversation ran long. Voices low enough through the door that I couldn't make out words, just tone, occasional pauses that felt significant. At one point I heard something that might have been Victor's voice cracking, and I had to resist the urge to knock. 40 minutes passed, maybe closer to 50. The door opened. Patricia stepped out first, her folder held against her chest now, and looked at me for a moment before saying anything. Not pity, exactly. Something closer to careful appraisal. "He'd like you to come in," she said. I stood up, setting my cold tea aside, and walked toward that door with absolutely no idea I was about to learn my stepfather had been keeping a secret from every single person in in his life for the better part of 2 years. He was sitting up in bed when I walked in, propped against pillows, something different in his posture than I'd seen at any point during the hospital stay. Straighter, more deliberate. "Sit down, Jenna," he said. Not unkind, but not a request either. I sat in the same chair I'd occupied for most of the past week and waited. "Your mother believes I lost most of what I had a few years back," he said. "The market downturn, the bad advice from that financial guy she liked. She's told people that story for years. Told you that story too, if I remember right." I did remember. It had become a kind of family fact, the explanation for why Victor, despite decades of careful work, seemed to live more modestly than anyone would have expected. "It isn't true," he said. "None of it. I moved a portion of what I had into an account she didn't know about before any of that even happened. And I never told her. And I never told anyone, because I wanted to understand something about the people in my life I couldn't understand any other way." Patricia, standing near the window with her folder open across her arm, spoke for the first time. "Victor asked me to help structure it years ago. Completely legal, completely separate from any marital assets." "Why?" I said, quieter than I meant it to. "Why let everyone think you had less than you did?" He was quiet a moment, his eyes somewhere past me. "Because money changes how people look at you," he said finally. "I wanted to know who would stay if there was nothing left to gain from staying. Who was actually here for me, and not for what I could still provide. And she failed that. She failed it before the tap water. The tap water was just the proof I already suspected I'd eventually get." His hand found mine, his grip weaker than it used to be, but still certain. "I've watched her for 2 years. Small things. The way she'd get frustrated with doctor's appointments cutting into her plans. I told myself I was imagining the worst of it. Then she left me on that floor for a cruise deposit." "What about me?" I asked, something rawer in my voice than I'd intended. "Did you ever wonder that about me too?" His grip tightened slightly. "Every year you were deployed, every leave you spent driving up here instead of somewhere easier, every time you called just to check on me when there was nothing to report. I didn't wonder about you, Jenna. I watched you prove it over and over without ever knowing there was anything to prove." I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment. Patricia busied herself with her folder, giving us a moment that didn't require an audience. "There's something else," Victor said, once I'd steadied myself. "Something I need you to hear clearly." "Okay. 2 years ago, when I moved that account, I also updated my will, quietly, entirely separate from anything your mother's attorney would ever have reason to look for." He paused, something in his face gathering weight before the next part. "I need you to understand, this isn't a reward for what happened this week. This decision was made 2 years before any of this. This week just confirmed I made the right one." "Victor," my voice shook slightly. "What did you do?" He looked at Patricia. She closed her folder gently, waiting for his nod before she spoke. "He restructured the entire trust," she said. 2 years ago. There's a figure attached I think you should hear from him, not from me." Victor's hand was still holding mine, steady despite everything. And when he finally said the number out loud, $3.2 million, structured entirely outside anything my mother could touch, I understood for the first time the actual size of what I'd walked into that room believing was simple paperwork. "Why are you telling me this now?" I managed. "Because I need you to know it exists before you decide what to do next," he said. "Because what's coming next is going to be difficult, and I need you walking into it with clear eyes." I assumed, still absorbing the number, that he meant the divorce, the ordinary painful mechanics of a family finally admitting what had been broken inside it. I had no idea he meant something else entirely. Something that hadn't happened yet, that was still, at that exact moment, unfolding somewhere I couldn't see, on a cruise ship several hundred miles away. Patricia stayed another hour, walking through documents I mostly absorbed in fragments, my attention still catching on that number, no matter how hard I tried to focus on the practical details around it. Before she left, she asked me a question that seemed incidental at the time, though I understand now it wasn't. "Do you still have that recording?" she asked. "The phone call with your mother." I told her I did. "Send it to me," she said, handing me a card. "Everything. The recording. Any photos you took of the medication, the discharge summary. I'm not asking as a formality. Your mother is going to need to explain herself somewhere more formal than a hospital hallway before this is finished." I sent it that night, sitting at the kitchen table in a house that finally held a comfortable temperature again, listening to the recording one more time burst. My mother's voice explaining the arithmetic of medication against vacation deposits with a casualness that still made my stomach turn. My mother and my brother and sister returned from the cruise 4 days later. Victor was home by then, stronger every day, and Patricia had asked us both not to say anything to them directly before she'd had the chance to formally deliver what needed delivering. It wasn't hard to stay quiet. I didn't want to give my mother advance warning to construct a better version of the explanation she'd already given me over the phone, unscripted and honest in the way people are honest when they don't know they're being recorded. Patricia scheduled a meeting for the following week, formal, in her office, with her own paralegal present as a witness, and a binder thick enough that I understood, finally and completely, how much evidence had accumulated around what my mother had done. I wasn't required to attend. Victor asked me to anyway. "I want you there," he said, steadier on his feet now. "Not to say anything, just to be present for it. You've earned the right to see how this ends." I sat beside him in a beige office overlooking a parking lot and watched my mother walk in already defensive, already prepared to argue her way out of whatever she assumed this meeting was about. She wasn't prepared for the binder. Patricia walked through it methodically. The medication bottle, tested and documented, the hospital records, the recorded phone call, played once, my mother's own voice filling that beige office with the exact words she'd used to explain herself to me in a hospital hallway. I watched her face while it played. I watched the moment she understood there was no version of this she could talk her way around. "That was a private conversation," she said when the recording ended. "It was a conversation you had knowing your husband husband nearly died from a decision you made, Patricia said without heat. The law doesn't require privacy protections for evidence of elder neglect, Elaine. I'd encourage you to consult your own attorney before you say anything further in this room. My mother looked at Victor then, and for one brief moment, something that might have been genuine fear crossed her face. Victor, you can't actually believe I meant for any of this to happen. It was a mistake. I panicked about money. I am so sorry, but you cannot let some misunderstanding turn into— I don't need you to explain it to me again, Elaine, Victor said. His voice was quiet, nothing uncertain in it. You already explained it to Jenna, and I've heard the recording enough times. She turned to me then, something pleading in her expression. Jenna, please, I'm your mother. You left him on the floor for 2 days, I said, steadier than I expected. You refilled his medication with tap water so you could afford a cruise deposit. I don't know what you want me to say to that. Patricia closed the binder, the sound settling into the quiet room with a finality that made everyone present understand, without needing to be told, that whatever came next was going to be delivered now, and delivered in full. I want to say something, Victor said, once the room had absorbed what it needed to absorb. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight underneath it. 2 years of careful silence finally being set down. Elaine, I'm not doing this to punish you. I want to be clear about that. I'm doing it because 2 years ago, I asked myself who would still be here if there was nothing left to gain from staying, and I already knew the answer before you left me on that floor. This week just made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. My mother's hands were shaking, not from cold, from something closer to the specific fear of watching a version of your future disappear in real time. What are you saying? She said, quieter now. The defensiveness had started to crack into something rawer. Patricia opened the folder she'd been holding since the meeting began. The one I now understood contained far more than trust documents. She slid a single page across the table, and my mother's eyes moved over it slowly, her face changing as she read. This is fraudulent, she said, but the conviction had gone out of her voice. You can't just cut me out. I'm your wife of 11 years. I have rights. This isn't— You have exactly the rights the law entitles you to, Patricia said, which, given the documented pattern of neglect and the evidence of intentional medication tampering, are considerably fewer than you're imagining right now. I'd strongly encourage you to have your attorney review this rather than continuing to argue the point with me. My mother turned to Victor one more time, and for a moment I saw something in her face that might have been genuine grief, buried under everything else. Grief for a version of this marriage that maybe had once been real before it hurtled into whatever it had become. 2 years, she said. You've been planning this for 2 years. I've been protecting myself for 2 years, he said. There's a difference, Elaine, even if you don't want to see it right now. She looked at my brother and sister, sitting silent through all of this. My brother's tan from the cruise looking suddenly garish under the office's fluorescent lighting. My sister's expensive sunglasses still pushed up into her hair like she'd walked in from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that had nothing to do with any of this. Neither of them said anything. I don't think either of them fully understood, in that moment, the size of what they were losing. Patricia let the silence sit for a moment before continuing, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more formal, more procedural, the voice of someone reading language she'd read many times before to many different families in many different versions of this exact room. The trust, as restructured 2 years ago, names a sole primary beneficiary and successor trustee, she said. I want to read this next part directly, because I think it matters that you hear it in the language Victor chose himself, not paraphrased. She looked up briefly at me before continuing. I am leaving the entirety of the trust to the one person in my life whose loyalty I never had to question, and who never once knew there was anything to prove. The room was very quiet. You're the only name in the envelope, Patricia said, closing the folder gently. He's been very clear about that from the beginning, and clearer still after this week. I don't fully remember what I said in response, if I said anything at all in that first moment. I remember the specific, disorienting sensation of an entire room's attention shifting onto me, my mother's face moving through something between disbelief and a kind of dawning, furious comprehension, my brother finally looking up from whatever he'd been staring at on the table, understanding arriving on his face several seconds behind everyone else's. Her, my mother said, not a question. A single flat word delivered like an accusation. You're giving all of it to her. I'm not giving anything to anyone, Victor said. I decided this 2 years ago. This meeting is just the first time any of you are hearing about a decision that was already made. She didn't even grow up in this family, Victor. She's not even really— Don't, Victor said, and something in his voice cut through the room with a sharpness I hadn't heard from him even in the hospital, even holding that empty bottle in his shaking hand. Don't finish that sentence, Elaine. Not in this room. Not after everything the last 2 weeks have shown me about who actually shows up when it matters and who doesn't. She didn't finish it. She sat there instead, hands still shaking slightly, watching whatever future she'd assumed was secured for her dissolve across a conference table in a beige office she'd probably never have to see the inside of again after today. Patricia gathered the remaining papers, squaring the edges with the particular unhurried precision of someone closing out a meeting that had gone exactly the way she'd expected it to go. There will be formal documentation sent to all parties within the week, she said. I'd recommend each of you retain your own counsel going forward. This meeting is concluded. My mother stood first, unsteady, my brother and sister following a beat behind her, none of them looking at me on their way out, none of them saying anything at all. And I sat there beside Victor in that quiet room and understood, finally and completely, the actual shape of what had been happening around me this entire time. The 2 years of careful watching, the deliberate silence, the test I hadn't even known I was taking until the exact moment I passed it. Victor's hand found mine again, steadier now than it had been at any point since I'd found him on that bathroom floor. I need you to understand something, he said. said, quiet enough that it felt like it was meant only for me, even with Patricia still gathering papers a few feet away. This isn't the reward. This was never the reward. The real thing was you walking through that door in the cold, 12 hours into a drive you didn't have to make, without knowing any of this was on the other side of it. I looked at him, at the steadiness that had come back into his face over these past 2 weeks, at the version of him I was only now understanding I'd been seeing the whole time without recognizing what I was looking at. I would have driven those 12 hours regardless, I said. You know that. I know that now, he said. I've known it for 2 years. I just needed the rest of the world to know it too. Outside the window, the parking lot sat gray and ordinary under an overcast sky, cars coming and going, people moving through lives that had no idea what had just happened in this room, and I sat there holding my stepfather's hand in the particular quiet that follows something enormous finally being said out loud, and for the first time since reading that note on the kitchen counter, I didn't feel the need to check the temperature of anything.